Thanks for coming. So I'm going to give a talk here about breaking up, how it's hard to do, not just in a relationship, sometimes at a business you work at, and how I use domain-driven design to break up two businesses. And before I start, my name is Dave, and the companies that I'm going to be talking about are LinkUp and Getwork. So LinkUp is the parent company, and they have been around for roughly 20 years. And they decided to split up the two businesses and create a new company called Getwork. There's about 55 people that work there, and they took 10 to 15 people, put them into Getwork, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. A little bit about the business. So on the top here, the first business model, which became Getwork's model, was how they got to where they were, connecting clients with jobs to fill, for job seekers. So it's a recruitment company, job search company, and that's the more real-time part of the business. And the most important part of Getwork and this business model was what jobs are active now. Having the most current data was very important. So LinkUp wanted to focus more on being a job data wholesaler. There's a lot of value in the many years of job data they have. Like I said, they've been around for 20 years. And it's a whole different type of client compared to the legacy model. And just a little bit more about Getwork. So they get jobs from clients. We work with a lot of direct clients, government clients, agencies, like Home Depot, Care.com. Work with a lot of trucking companies. Just over the years, they built up this business. So we want to get the jobs into our system so that we can then massage the data into our CRM and do some campaign management. And that's kind of the value of Getwork and why clients want to work with us, because we can segment all that data. And on the other end of it, we want to export all that segmented job data to our networks that we work with. And at that point, that's where you get applicants and people looking for the jobs. So the mission, like I said, my name is Dave, and I was the first hire at Getwork. I was the only tech person at the company to start. And the main mission that I was given was to break apart the software. So each business model could operate independently. So, quick question. What comes to mind seeing this diagram? I'm sorry. Ball of mud? Did I hear something? Convoluted. Typical. Very good. So I've seen this quite a few times, and for me, it's chaos. And we'll come back, we'll revisit this later on. And also, if you look at it a little closer, it's microservices done wrong. Another part of the mission that I was given, other than, if we go back, separating the software, the two businesses, also moving from an on-prem data center to the cloud. So given all of that, it's quite a bit of challenge. Great opportunity. There's older software as well, legacy software that's not well documented. Then there was a wrench. 3 weeks after I started working at Getwork, 3 out of the 4 key tech people at LinkUp all left. So the 3 out of the 4 core software people decided to move on. I think they were just kind of burnt out, moved to a different company. So with that, we lost a ton of institutional knowledge on the tech side of things. And the remaining team had to, keep their, all their time was occupied just keeping the business afloat, the current software that was running in the data center. So again, big wrench thrown in the way. And there's a lot of complicated business rules that we had to also uncover that now we didn't even know how this software was running because all the people that had written it and supported it for 10 years all left. So this is where domain-driven design came to my advantage. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on 4 things. The first one will be understanding the business. Second part is crafting the plan, once we gained the understanding of the business and the knowledge. And the third part is infrastructure, and lastly, execution of the plan. So let's get into it. I've done domain-driven design for 12 years. This was obviously the hardest challenge that I've had. But I was excited to learn these, apply these learnings that I've had over the years with domain-driven design. It was a really good opportunity to have a lot of success. So the first thing I did was I met with all the stakeholders. I did one-on-one meetings with the leadership and the people that knew the business. So this is what I leaned on heavily. So I had the advantage, there's a wrench of all the tech people leaving, but I had this advantage of a lot of people that had long tenure at LinkUp and Getwork. All these decision makers and leaders had been with the company for over 10 years. So I leaned on them heavily. And while I was meeting with them, I started kind of building a glossary of common things that I heard. And I put a little asterisk next to the key terms or acronyms that people would tell me. And this was the start of documenting the ubiquitous language, which is 100% essential to understanding the business and moving on to the next part. So I started to share this glossary and make sure people agreed, and it was kind of the thing that we shared with any new employee from that point on. So we were all using the same terminology and in the different contexts of the business. I also met with the CEO of LinkUp, and like the other people, he had been there, and he's still there, 15 years. So he's very familiar with the industry. And I just asked him, why did you do this? Why did you break apart these two companies? What's the goal here? What's the mission, non-technical mission? Basically, he just said, let's get it done so we can grow these two businesses independently and scale them up. And maintain the quality services that we have. So after these meetings and gaining some understanding and building some context, I did some event storming. However, this was still in COVID, so everybody was working remotely. I had not even met anyone in person at the company, even though we were all in the same 30-mile radius. So I started to do some research online on how people were doing event storming now that you couldn't do it in person. It's a highly asynchronous process, which you all are probably well aware of. So I turned to Miro, and it was a really good tool. And so I started to schedule some meetings before we actually had the first event storming, which was going to be high level, what the business does, why it exists. But before we did that, the day before, I kind of just did a 30-minute meeting where people could get familiar with Miro, and I showed them, the different colors and sticky notes and what they meant and kind of the process that you go through. So then they had that in their minds the next day when we actually did the event storming. And the key to this session was to make sure people were thinking big enough, and being open-ended and having an organic process. It's a little trickier when you're all on Zoom calls and you can't be as asynchronous. Only one person can talk at a time. So I kind of broke up the session. Instead of doing one large session, I did 3 chunks, and then I left the Miro link open and posted that in Slack and created a separate channel in Slack just for this event storming. So at the end of those Zoom meetings, a week after that, we were ready for the next step. And these are just other screenshots of the different boundaries that we kind of discovered along the way. Then we were ready for modeling the domain. Event storming had given us a thorough understanding of the business and the events that happened. So we were ready to actually go back to that whiteboard. And this was done with the tech team that was still around from the parent company, and my team that I had brought on. And we basically just sat in a room and tried to uncover all the different systems. It's a lot of complicated things going on, and like I said, two business models all operating in the same environment. But the gist of it here is the orange is Getwork and the blue is LinkUp. And so we kept asking ourselves, how could Getwork live independently from LinkUp without any dependencies? So basically it was just, you got to remove all the blue. And you can see some of these lines will show you like direct calls or shared libraries if you look closer, but we're not going to do that. So I took that whiteboard and I kind of formalized it better into a digital diagram. That's a little blurry on there. Wow. Sorry. But it was a shareable diagram that then I could share with the rest of the company. And as I'm checking in with leadership or other stakeholders at the business. And it was pretty digestible. But basically, in a nutshell, the bottom part is all the LinkUp dependencies, and the red is direct database calls. So at some point, I think it was just easier for developers. They had other developers over 10, 12 years that they had built like a microservice architecture, but then other people would come in and just be like, it's way easier. I can just query that database directly. So this was a big discovery for my team because they weren't really doing microservices that well. And it basically gave us a path forward, getting rid of all the red. Once we got through that, we kind of identified this one front of replacing the direct database calls. We started talking about, what was the future state? What's the ideal architecture? And how do we minimize the dependency that we have with LinkUp? We were still going to need their job data. I don't need to get into it now, but we still needed to get their job data into our system. So we still had to figure out how we were going to interact with them at the most minimal thing. We weren't going to be calling their database because we were going to be in Amazon and they're still going to be at the data center. So we came up with this architecture, a little bit more simplified. And then on the bottom left here, you can see that the LinkUp mention is just a feed. It's just a XML feed. So funny thing about the job industry, it's all XML. They're sharing these large XML files all around. Kind of crazy. Another thing we identified, if you go back to here, was there's just a lot going on. So basically, we're doing too many microservices. A lot of them were calling, like I said, a lot of them were calling each other with direct database calls. There was also this shared libraries that they were using. So they were pulling in all these core libraries into all the different repositories. And the current boundaries of all these services were a bit fuzzy, which is probably why they had a lot of these cross-boundary calls, lots of duplicate data, lots of data processing, huge payloads in their API calls that they were actually using. So going through this process, we also established, a better understanding of the domain. And too many microservices for the small team that we were going to have. I knew we weren't ever going to have, 15 developers. We'd probably not have any more than 5 or 6 as a smaller company. And also, all these things were very hard to run locally. So we started creating loosely coupled subdomains within, a new repository, this new service that we were creating. So it left the door open if we wanted to make them into microservices running on their own later on. So they were loosely coupled. They weren't calling each other's databases. So each little circle there had its own database. And we were using service classes to talk to each other. So replacing the database calls was crucial, obviously, as it would allow a more iterative migration to AWS. This would also reduce risks to our business, so we could do these small incremental migrations of each system. So a second front that we had to do was replace this legacy scrape system that was used for a myriad of reasons, different use cases that LinkUp had. So Getwork's business needs was different than LinkUp as far as how they got their job data and what jobs they wanted. LinkUp is trying to get all the jobs, as many as possible, directly from websites, corporate websites, whereas Getwork is working with direct clients, and they're paying us, and they send us a feed of jobs. So this scrape system was doing a lot of work that Getwork didn't really need. But we still needed to ingest job data for all our clients. So that was another thing we decided we needed to do for this whole separating of the business, was to build a new system. So I decided to have a more focused event storming. Now that the core people that I was working with at the company already knew how to do event storming, now we could dive into this new process that we wanted to build on how we got jobs into our system. So it was more focused and kind of the ideal scenario for the current business needs. And it was simplifying a lot of things greatly for the internal stakeholders. Like the tools they were using took them a lot of work to just get jobs into their system. And, if they're working with a new client, it was a long process to actually get that data into the system, and they could tell the client, yeah, we got it, and it all looks good. It was all delayed. It was like 2 or 3 days. So we did this event storming to simplify a lot of things. And from there, I created a pipeline, a diagram. And all of these artifacts that I was making along the way were really good to share with the company, so we could show that we were moving forward with this approach, and they could be part of it. So this was the data pipeline on how we got these XML feeds, JSON feeds. Sometimes it's even just a CSV on an FTP site that we would need to pull down. So we kind of architected from the event storming. We were able to architect this pipeline, which was part of the new system we were building. So now we go into the, building the plan. We've kind of gone through all this, understanding the business, and how we are going to approach things and simplify things. So now we had 2 fronts that we were going to work on. And so basically, just me and my team, we started putting in all the tasks and identifying kind of the order of operations and blockers, which was kind of the most important thing with a complicated business and all these microservices. What are the blockers on all the tasks that we have to do, on these 2 initiatives? So I spent a lot of time putting that all into our project management tool, which at the time, was Asana. And eventually, I identified a lot of the blockers, and the order was established. And then from each group of tasks, I kind of did the agile way, where you give a complexity score rather than a time estimation. When almost all of my coworkers were remote at the time, over communication is the key to any plan, any successful plan. A plan is nothing if nobody understands it or remembers the key parts. So I had a lot of meetings, a lot of check-ins once I had everything in the project management tool. And Asana was a good tool at the time because it provided a really simple way to share, like a one-pager of where things were, and I could share with leadership. I also did a lot of walkthroughs of all the sessions that we did internally with the executive team. But yeah, over communication, super important, especially when everybody's remote. And the next question people are going to ask, once I've got all of this, we went through this whole process, finally got all the tasks identified, of course, the next question is, how long is it going to take? When are you going to be done? So I didn't want to give timelines at the beginning because there was a lot of things that, my team had never worked on, a lot of this software, and we were making changes, as things are in production already. And we were doing a lot of learning and discovery of how the code actually was working. So it wasn't until after 2 weeks of sprints that I was able to give a rough estimate. So the 2 tracks of work, the API work and the new system, the new ingestion system, it had a lot of complex solutions, and we wanted to have testing in there as well. So after completing 2, maybe 3 sprints, then I could look back at the complexity score that I gave to these tasks and kind of get a pretty good gauge of how much effort it was going to take to get everything else done. And it also factored in, the maintenance that we had to do. Our on-prem data center was not doing well. Things were falling apart. So there was a lot of support that we all had to do along the way. But anyways, I was able to give a rough estimate, which is for leadership. This was the answer they've been looking for since I started at Getwork. And this was 6 months after I started working there. So now the more exciting part, infrastructure. People familiar with this book? Okay. So there was a talk here, I think in 2018, first time I was at this conference, and people were referencing this book and everybody was talking about it. So for me, I'm kind of a late adopter to some things. I didn't get around to reading it until I took this job at Getwork, and I knew that I was going to need something to rely on, something that I knew people were talking about for years. So that's when I finally read the book. But the gist of the book for me is you can build a high-performing team and turn your technology into a competitive advantage with DevOps. And there's proof in this book, if you haven't read it. They examined all these different approaches and ways of writing software. But basically, you need to have resilient deployment pipelines that can detect when your production errors fail. You got to have testable features and loosely coupled services. So this is one of them, MTTR. Basically, this is just how quickly can you realize that there's an error in production, and how quickly can you recover from it. So you just measure that in time. And then just how testable is your software or your microservice, and I just started giving these things, all our services, a score, and you'll see here in a couple slides. And then how deployable, how fast can you commit a change locally, how long does it take to get that into production? And how often do you deploy? So from reading this book, it quickly became apparent that there was a whole gap that I still hadn't addressed. Nobody at LinkUp, or I couldn't find it, had put together any SLAs on all this critical parts of the company, and what are the revenue impacting things, what's acceptable. I had no idea. Oh, I had some idea, but I didn't know all the things. So I built an SLA working with leadership, and then from there I could create metrics and started tracking those before we migrated anything. And that was really important, so then we could have sort of apples to apples when we move things to AWS, we could compare the metrics. And this is just one example. So super important metric at Getwork is clicks and conversions. So people clicking on your redirect, people clicking on a job and then they redirect through Getwork to the client to apply for a job. And then conversions are, they actually applied for the job and we get like a post back. two really important pieces of data, and this is just a diagram how it was working at the time. And another thing is to have the real-time alerting and reporting, and choosing a tool early on in this process was important. And having alerts so everybody could see these alerts and you had full exposure. Also, going back to the Accelerate book, you always want to run these tests, integration, sanity tests, whatever you got. Make sure those are part of your pipeline. So this was kind of like our, what we wanted to do when we built this infrastructure, because it was all brand new. And you also want to be able to, detect and roll back changes easily. I'm also a big fan of keeping track of the code health, and it kind of aligns with the Accelerate book and these metrics. So if you look on the left column, those are the different microservices at Getwork. And there used to be more, but this was very critical because then we could measure it, over time. So all of these things, like how testable is your application, how fast and how often do you do changes, how quickly can you recover. All of this kind of factored into the infrastructure plan that we came up with. And we also, my mission was to separate the two businesses so that they could operate on their own. But we also wanted to set up the company so it could scale and grow. Now that we were in the cloud and you're kind of unconstrained, we were in this data center and we were pretty constrained by the hardware that we had. So we wanted to put the business in the best place for that, so it could grow and scale once we were done with this and be able to do fast feature development. So we started building pipelines along the way and, kind of testing things out. There was a lot of learning that was going on as well with my team. A lot of this was newer things that we hadn't done before. But going back to the plan, this became a third front in the plan. So we were building these pipelines as we were working on, the other parts of the project, getting rid of the database calls, removing microservices, consolidating things, and building this whole new important feature for the feed ingestion. So, the infrastructure became a third part, and we also want to ensure the continuity of the business. And the infrastructure we wanted would allow us to release all of these changes along the way. And this is a diagram, another diagram that was an artifact that I could share with leadership, even though they didn't, understand a lot of the icons or anything. It showed all the systems, and the big circle was our Kubernetes cluster that we had put up, and then the things outside the circle were kind of like external services that we worked with. We had a Tableau for internal BI. We worked with Google Job Search, because we sent them all of our jobs, and some other external things. Any questions right now? I'm getting close to the end. Go ahead.
Earlier you said not being able to run this stuff locally was a challenge. Do you ever get a solution to that, or can you give a real metric as to how that hindered you?
Yeah, it did hinder us.
Maybe repeat the question, Dave.
Oh, sorry. So she was asking a really good question that I should have delved more into. Basically, running all these microservices locally, what were the problems and how it how it slowed us down and how we overcame that. And basically, reducing the footprint and reducing the amount of microservices made it easier. We basically reduced it so it was more in line with the team. So we had a team of 5, and we were working a lot with external people. So we went from like 10, 12 microservices. Like for a while there was just any new feature, they were creating a microservice, even though there was only 3 developers at the time. So that reducing that footprint, and then we used just Docker Compose locally, and I forget the proxy. This traffic proxy was kind of the game changer for us locally. And then we could run these things, because you didn't have to have all this stuff running just to be able to like debug and test things. Did that answer your question? Anybody else? All right, well, there'll be time at the end. So the last part, is execution. Like, how did we do this? So these were the pillars, the three fronts to our work that we had to do. And a lot of it was, being adaptable, and, checking in constantly. I don't know, we just kept working the plan, and keeping it updated, keeping everyone updated. And other important things was just mitigating the risk. Obviously everyone at the company agreed we didn't want to lose revenue, and we wanted to keep our clients happy. We also informed them as we were like moving some of their stuff. But just putting the things in place, tracking the key metrics, that would ensure we didn't lose revenue, like clicks, conversions, errors, number of errors, how often they occur. Specific clients we would focus on. We had, Getwork at the time had 4 or 5 really big clients that were tied to like government agencies like the FBI, Navy, Border Patrol. Like we were working with all these really important, and it was a big chunk of our revenue, so we would have alerts just for them. And I wanted to know within an hour or two, after we did a migration of one of these microservices, if something wasn't right. And we were also outsourcing a great deal of the work. And for me, the key is to not rely on external people to write your core capabilities. This being like main revenue generating logic or intellectual properties of the business. So those things are critical, so they should be done internally, because people internally usually have they're more vested, more interested. And if it's not possible, which in our case wasn't always possible to do all the core things internally, pick the external people you trust the most. We had one company that I had a long relationship with the guy that owns the company, so I picked him for some of the really risky parts and changes. But our plan, the execution, I think with a plan like this, with all, like I said at the beginning, we lost all this knowledge. There was a lot of stuff happening. This is 10, 15-year-old code, and we were putting in a whole new system, and we were running things in the cloud that had never run in the cloud before, very complicated, and huge database queries that were optimized for hardware, physical hardware. But this is kind of the main points on how we executed the plan. And like I said, the external people, they worked on, important features, but not critical, revenue impacting software. And we're also, while we were moving things, everything was still running in the on-prem. So at a time, this lasted for 4 to 5 months. So we had to kind of have this dual sort of environment, on-prem and in the cloud. So as far as how it went, because we did all this upfront work, I think it paved the path for success. We had reliable pipelines. We could do fast releases. We could detect when things were broken. We could detect when revenue was impacted. It enabled a pretty smooth migration. There was some stressful moments, of course, but we didn't lose any business. And at the end of the day, we had moved to the cloud and not just taken, initially I think some of the people at LinkUp, they just said, well, you can just take all this stuff and just put it in Amazon. Well, at the end of the day, then you're still running like you're in a data center. You're not running like you're in the cloud. Because we had built it up where we had levers, using AWS, where you could grow, scale the business up or down based off the needs. If like in 2022, the industry was doing really well, so we were cranking everything up and processing a lot of data. And then when the industry kind of tailed off, we could dial it down and save, costs on the cloud. And we also, with all the, detection and logging and real-time metrics, we had a feedback loop, so we could constantly work in new features and get the feedback back and kind of work, that loop over and over again. So that's the good results. Part of the bad results. And this just happens with small companies, I think, or I'm quite familiar with, and maybe you guys are too. So the company got acquired, and and they just had their own way of doing things. As a much bigger company than us, we had 15 people and they had 120 people. So it was good, process for us. We did a lot of learning. And I will say that was another part that wasn't as great, as we had to we should have factored in the learning more, especially all this infrastructure stuff that was new to us, Kubernetes, Argo CD. These are things that we didn't ever work with before. So we were kind of doing it on the fly, and we didn't factor that in. So that made the process take longer. But at the end of the day, kind of a sad way it ended. The company that bought us, they wanted to just keep maintain their platform. So they basically just moved all of our functionality into theirs. They rewrote it all. And at the end of the day, they shut it all off. So that's the dump truck. I'm driving away, goodbye. So yeah, that's the end of the talk. I just added that slide last minute.